And so welcome everyone. This is the Responsible Global Academic Partnerships Training, and this is workshop 2, where we are going to look at power dynamics in partnerships. Welcome to all of you. I would like to start by giving you a very brief overview of what you can expect. I'm going to outline very briefly the purpose and the program of the workshop, give you a little bit of housekeeping and some background on me as your facilitator for today. So the purpose of the workshop, and you will have seen this in the information that was shared with you in preparation for the workshop, we really aim to provide you today with a deeper understanding of power dynamics in North-South partnerships, and also offer and share some tools and ideas as to how we can address related challenges in these partnerships. And the use of normative Eurocentric concepts, as well as frameworks and decolonial approaches, not only to partnerships, but to internationalization in general, will be particularly highlighted. So you know the key frame for us for these discussions, not only for today, but for the entire training, is to focus on international partnerships, particularly those between institutions in the global north and the global south, because of the context of the global networks that you are part of. And of course, these partnerships focus on education and research, and the specific kind of like zoom lens that we put on today is on power dynamics in these partnerships, as I said, and as the title suggests. So this is the program, the overview of the program for today. We are right in the middle of the first thing, the welcome and opening, which I'm doing. Then we have a guest speaker, Dr. James Otieno-Joey, who will outline some of the issues today that are relevant and as he sees them. We will then proceed to a plenary discussion where I would like us to particularly focus on the issues around coloniality, or the concepts, the terms of coloniality and decoloniality. And then we will break away into our sessions where we will discuss in smaller groups the power dynamics that we see in or have experienced in North-South partnerships and what we are able to do about them. Then we'll come back into the plenary before we have our final closing remarks and close the session. And in terms of the feedback that we received on the registration form that all of you used to register for this workshop, someone, for example, said, I want to check my own prejudice, which is exactly linked to this willingness to share, learn, and unlearn. So this is a very diverse group, which generally makes for very rich discussions. And so I look forward to facilitating that with and for you today. Let me give you a little bit of background about myself. I'm probably not new to many of you who are joining us today because this is workshop 2. So just very briefly, I'm Zamia. I have a background of working in international education for more than 20 years now. My specific focus, and that is in terms of my work, but also in terms of my research interest, is on international partnerships, particularly in that North-South dynamic, which is mostly due to the fact, I think, that I was born and raised in Germany, but have worked and lived in South Africa for 20 years now. And I am also particularly interested in exploring decolonial approaches to internationalization in general and to partnerships in particular. So the perspectives that I represent, if I can say that in a nutshell, are those of a practitioner and scholar. Of course, I think I focused mostly on the global South perspectives in this particular workshop, and I am using my experiences particularly of the South African context. Now, we wanted to kick off with our guest speaker, Dr. James Otieno-Joey, and I have to ask for you to please address us first, and then we'll invite the audience to join in. I'm going to stop sharing, Joey, so to give you an opportunity to share your slides. Perfect. Joey, thank you so much for joining us here today. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Samia, for the opportunity to share with the colleagues in this meeting. And I've already got quite a number of reflections that you are going on with. And maybe I could begin by reflecting a bit on the Margaret Thatcher on the name of the library where the ANI offices are located. And this seems to be quite interesting, also noting that the African Network for Internationalization of Education is located in that building. So maybe by way of introduction to most, I've seen most of the colleagues here, we've not interacted. I'm James Joey. I'm from Kenya originally, but currently I work at the East African Community Secretariat. The East African Community brings together Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and now the Democratic Republic of Congo has joined. So part of what we do is to work together as a regional economic community, and we harmonize a number of our practices, including in education. I head the education sector, so we are harmonizing our curricula. We are developing frameworks for mobility of students and staff, frameworks for mutual recognition agreements. We are developing centers of excellence, amongst other things. We are in Burundi now we are meeting together as the countries that I've mentioned to set up a center for for studies in regional integration, and we have a number of European partners also working together with us on this. So once again, sorry to be late. Margaret Thatcher herself came to Kenya in the 90s and visited this university when it was starting, and one of the key challenges was a library. And she decided to support the university develop a library through the support from the UK. And through that, the university decided to name the library after her through the intervention that she made in enabling the university to have the library. So that's actually how the name comes in, and you relate it now to coloniality. And actually, part of this comes into the effort we are undertaking now. We were trying to get a name for this regional center we are setting up. The colleagues we are working on from Europe have the Jean Monnet centers, the whatever centers with names from famous Europeans, and we were trying to see whether it becomes Nyerere Center or etc. But let me go back to my slides, and maybe we'll come back to those in the reflections. And when Samia introduced me to this, we were mainly to talk about the power relations between the North and the South in terms of higher education relations. And this is an area we have worked with Samia for quite a bit of time. So I'll not spend so much time on this, but that slide just contextualizes what I'm going to talk about, because I'm discussing this within the context of internationalization and the partnerships between Africa and other regions. And just to mention that Africa has relations with almost all other regions of the world, but this discussion will largely focus on the relations with Europe, but there is growing relations with China, with India, with within the South-South collaborations, and a lot going on within Africa itself, within the intra-Africa partnerships. And briefly, with the contextualizing internationalization, the main essence of this slide is to show that higher education in Africa is rather recent compared to other parts of the world, but is largely a consequence or an outcome of coloniality that Samia has been talking about. And most of our pioneer universities were outcomes of the efforts of the colonial powers which were in Africa by then. The colonial powers which set up the universities based on the traditions of those former colonial powers. So you'll find that most of Eastern Africa, we were under the British rule, and the universities in those countries have actually followed the British tradition. West Africa largely under the French rule, and till today, what happens in France, the French system actually influences a lot of what goes on in the most of West Africa, higher education sector. The Portuguese colonies, or the countries that in Africa that were colonized by the Portuguese, most of the relations in internationalization are again still with Portugal and Brazil. So you'll see how coloniality that Samia has been talking about even characterizes and influences many things in higher education, even as we talk now. Generally, after most of African countries have been independent for about 50, 60 years, meaning very young universities, and a number of universities have been established in the recent past. And what I would like to express here is that African universities, based on that history, faces internationalization and their collaborations with the other parts of the world from that colonial background. And largely through their history with the weaker capacities in research, weaker policies, weaker strategies, and which make them not to have a very strategic platform to stand on in characterizing or developing their partnerships. And this has led to the unequal partnerships, I think, that you have been talking about, which in some ways we can also associate with the coloniality aspect. And of late, there have been a number of attempts to actually unpack this. We've been just in about yesterday actually with a team from South Africa, we were discussing the same, how this continues to characterize higher education and a number of activities within the higher education spectrum, and how we can be conscious of this, but try to unpack it and see that we develop relations that are not so much structured within that coloniality. And one of the questions was whether the West is still reading Africa from the colonial library. And so, as I had mentioned earlier, there are the North-South partnerships and the South-South and the intra-Africa partnerships, which is now growing, and the regionalization, like what I've talked about, that is happening within the East African community, it's happening within SADC and other African regions, and maybe within other regions in the world. And this has some very interesting dimensions which are beginning to come up, and we see a lot of mobility, a bit of mobility of students within the region growing. Centers of excellence, which can also perpetuate the same mobility of both staff and students growing. Development of regional instruments and policies and frameworks, which can also be useful even for wider global interactions, also growing. But I think that we can discuss on another day. Since largely the participants in these are largely from Europe, we note that Europe has quite a long history with higher education. And as I mentioned, most of the pioneer universities in Africa were modeled within the European traditions, and even the current ones are following the same. And in studies that have been undertaken recently, most African universities indicate that they would most preferably relate or partner with the universities in Europe. And this is due to a number of reasons which I've mentioned there below, including geographical proximity of many African countries to Europe compared to other world regions, and the role that Europe is playing in the global knowledge society, but also due to that colonial past that you've been discussing and the relations that continue to exist that Samia was talking about. And also the fact that for a long time, relationships and partnerships between universities within Africa itself has not been strong, and it's just now beginning to grow. So I think in the future going forward, maybe this will turn around so that we see more interactions between African universities themselves, and then maybe Europe and other regions coming second. I think this slide on which I am now could be the most relevant for this discussion. The asymmetries that exist between us, and these could be seen largely within the North-South collaborations or divide that you are on. And I've already mentioned that historical and colonial legacy, which has actually for quite some time and even now is still very much in the mindset of most people in the South, and maybe still in the North also. And this has also characterized the imbalances that are in partnerships. And I think Samia could have mentioned this because this is part of what she has worked a lot on. We live in a very unequal world, and that is also being depicted in our higher education relations. And due to the weaknesses that I've already mentioned just about a minute ago, African universities have not got the best from the partnerships that they have been in, due to these imbalances, and partly which are colonially based. And this has also led to the knowledge dominance. I know that there are imbalances and there is much more research being done in the developed parts of the world, but even the little that comes out of Africa does not permeate and get into the other parts of the world due to the connotations that we have about issues of quality, issues of the West having the, the most dominant edge of research. And this raises a number of questions as we go into the future, whether this can continue, how we deal with the structural barriers which are there. We were talking about this yesterday, about publications, journals through which African scholars can publish, because there are lots of barriers getting into the journals, for example, of based in Europe, not necessarily at times based on quality, but at times based on prejudices. And I think these are some of the things that we could look into when we are in these discussions, and also relate them to the issues of coloniality. And the last point there is about the very recent events of the COVID-19 situation. We got very clear images, and one message that the COVID situation posed to us was that we can all be vulnerable. We've always seen Europe as the superpower. Let me use that in quotes. And we always see Europe as able to sort for us all our challenges. But I think within the higher education sector and all other aspects of life, COVID-19 caught us flat-footed. And it has been a very important turning point for the African higher education sector, especially with a bit of digitalization coming in. Mobility was not possible. Collaborations were put to a halt for some time, and new trajectories seem to be coming. And I think it would be very interesting to see how these relate to the future of internationalization. I think before I get to this issue of the good practices which can be there, since I got into this field of internationalization, the discussion doesn't seem to be changing. We have been talking about the asymmetries, the imbalances, and recently I've been participating in another conference of internationalization practitioners and researchers, and the narrative is still the same. How can we advance this? Because I've been in this over 10 years, I think it's going to 15, almost 20 years, but the discussion is still the same. So are we actually making any difference? And what deliberate steps can be there so that we already identify where the challenges are. We already have identified what the problems are. We already know where the weaknesses are, both in the African context, the strengths that Europe has, the opportunities that Africa has, the difference that Africa can make, what Africa can bring on the table, but the narrative still remains the same. So I think, and also looking at this from the discussion on coloniality, the coloniality and the decoloniality which is going on, how can we actually make a difference in this? Because we'll continue and years come by and we continue with the same debate. So I think all of us from where we sit, maybe there is just some little thing that we can do to make a difference, to break the barriers, to actually ensure that that little project you are working on, that little project you are developing has some of the good practices built on. And some of them have been listed here, and I think that these are issues that you all know. And I think I could just get towards the final parts of it by just outlining some of these very interesting things that are happening in Africa now, including the possibilities that the COVID-19 has given, and also the implications that this can have on the traditional key activities in internationalization, mobility, how it can actually transform research, how it can actually transform and give more opportunities to better our partnerships, how we can have better strategies and ways of relating, especially with these new opportunities and developments that are taking place in the African higher education sector. The expansion in access, the new governance reforms that are going on, the renewed interest, especially with international agencies work. Right now we have the Europe-Africa discussions going on. And there is the big meeting again coming in Barcelona, I think in a few days' time, UNESCO conference and the place of Africa in the same. So I think the opportunities through which this can be changed and through which we can change the debate and where we can actually come out of that colonial library and actually open up the space so that I know that a bit of what has been structuring this is funding. I've just come from a meeting this morning where we have very good opportunities, we have good ideas, but we can't fund them. And usually it is said that he who pays the piper calls the tune. I currently work at the East African community where we are a regional bloc. The countries put their budgets together, but this budget is not adequate. We have our partners abroad who will come to assist us, but they'll say, for us, we are interested in supporting this, we are interested in supporting this, while we have our 5-year development strategy. But what this partner would like to fund is falling out of. But you have to take it because that is what they want to fund, and now see how it will relate to what you want to do. I think I had just about 10 to 15 minutes, but what I think would be my summary message is that we have to see, especially within whatever we do in higher education, how we can bring in possibilities of reducing the asymmetries, and also the trying to, because a lot of this is in the mental faculties of many people, especially young Africans, how we deal with the coloniality. We cannot talk about the colonial past for more than 60 years after independence, if at all there were no issues within it. And the more we get on with this, the more we may, I think Samia, you explained very well what happened in South Africa, the fees must fall, the changes of names and etc. And that is quite recent. And I don't know how much this will possibly be replicated in other African countries. It's not desirable, but I think if at all we take a collective effort, collective responsibility to see that we make things better. And this might be difficult from a very large scale, but this calls for responsibility from where we each work, from what we all do, that we can embrace the good practices, build them into whatever we do. I know the challenge is there. And as I said earlier, we live in a very unequal world. The ground cannot be the same for all of us, but we should try as much as possible to make it better from wherever we are. Samia, I think I want to summarize what my presentation is by that and give more room for discussions. And once again, apologize for coming in quite late. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joey, and no apologies needed at all. I think we are really privileged that we've had a chance to get you here. And thank you so much for this presentation, for providing us with the with the background around European and African relations, with some of the challenges. But I really, really like your focus on, so what? What are we going to do about it? And your call to action. I mean, this workshop, I think, tries to play a small part in that, in the sense that we encourage people who have positive experiences, who have ideas of how we can tackle some of these challenges, to actually share them so that we can all learn from that. And I also really like, and I think that's part of the complexity that you have begun to outline for us, is that, there is a lot of complicity in the South. There is a lot more agency, I think, that we need in the South, and that we cannot move forward, I think, without things changing everywhere. And so I think this is something that, for a platform like the one today, where we have colleagues from northern institutions, colleagues from southern institutions, colleagues from very different networks working with each other, I think this is a very, very important point that you made. And that we all have to start small. There is one of the things that I have taken on as a kind of like my own personal decolonization agenda, is that when I go and do talks and things like this, I always try to find an African proverb or an African wisdom that speaks to what I'm talking about. And one that I was reminded of when you were calling us to action is this African saying that says, if you want to move mountains tomorrow, you have to start by lifting stones today. So, I think this is something that applies to this context. We understand that the challenges, the magnitude is enormous. But if we don't start doing small things, and we can do things immediately in the partnerships, in the networks that we are engaged in, then we can bring about this change and move that proverbial mountain. So thank you so much, James. I would like to invite all of you. I see there is a comment from Ken in the chat who agrees that the discussion has been going on too long. We really need to move on now to action. If there is anybody else who would like to speak, please come up, type in the chat or raise your hand. Joey, there was a question earlier from Salah in the chat box. I'm going back quite a bit, who says, how would you define the difference between colonialism and imperialism when discussing structures and designs? My immediate response would be that the difference for me is more about who is at the center. For colonialism, I think that's Europe. For imperialism, that's the United States. But in terms of the structures and the designs of domination, as we see them play out in partnerships, they are very similar. But Joey, perhaps you want to add on to that. And while you do that, I will look at the chat box and see if there are any other questions that we can take up.
Yeah, actually, I don't know how best to respond to that, the difference or the relationship between colonialism and imperialism, but I think I see them as being related, but imperialism for me denotes a lot of much more the imbalance that should be there. Something, the imperial power, it actually shows that imbalance, and the colonialism for me relates to it's much more historic now, but still very much alive with us. But still there are quite a lot of imperial practices which are still very, very present today. So maybe imperialism today perpetuates what was coloniality in the past, even after independence. And imperialism can even now, to me, even relate to the new neocolonial forces we see. I was discussing yesterday in the meeting that we had, like the colonial past. When I go to the airport in Entebbe, and allow me to use that to relate it to this, to imperialism and some of the powers that we may not see overtly. I see in Uganda, every time I'm at the airport in Entebbe, very many groups of young people being taken to work outside the country, menial jobs being put in the same uniform. They are going to work in the Middle East, or I don't see it much in Kenya, Rwanda, or Burundi. But while we had coloniality, we had slavery, and this was with the presence of the colonial powers. Right now, we are going by our own into forced labor, very much modern day slavery into the Middle East, into other parts of the, and so I would relate that possibly to imperialism, the underhand that you actually do not see overtly. But now that we are in the knowledge domain, how do we apply this into the knowledge domain? Yeah. And that is where we have the knowledge imbalances, where some people who are looking at the indigenous knowledges and even very advanced researchers from Africa, which actually cognition is not taken of them, and mainly because it comes from. So I could relate it to that, and maybe the debate could then relate to how we relate imperialism to the knowledge debate.
Yeah, thank you, I think that's a very important point. And again, you've kind of like, given us an illustration of how complex these issues are. We are using a lot of terms that I think we could spend days discussing, what they mean, how they relate to each other. Here, we're trying to touch on so many things in the short period of 2 hours of a workshop. I think that example that we used in the first workshop around film and how dominant the concept of a Hollywood movie has become in terms of what we expect of a movie and how we interpret film language, etc. I think that's also related to this conversation about imperialism. And I think, Joey, from some of the things that you mentioned, also the connection to globalization, neoliberalism, etc., etc. I would like to, Joey, we've lost your camera, so I hope you are still with us. I would like to just briefly touch on, and we only have about 3 minutes left, on some of the things that are mentioned in the chat. So there seems to be some agreement that we should start small, but also the question, but how? And what is it that we can do specifically to reduce asymmetries? Victor has given an example of what that means in the context of peer review, for example. So publication is one of the challenges that you highlighted, Joey. So I'm going to ask people to read through that. Let's go to Anna Maria's question about I would like very much to hear about those small and also the big things that we can do to reduce asymmetries. And Melissa made a comment actually that I think is related to that, which says that, yes, we must start small, but we also need to work at different levels within our own partnerships, but also in policy dialogues and perhaps at multiple levels. So these are the things, Joey, that I'd like you to, as a closing comment, to say, if we say we all have a role to play and there are things that we can do as practitioners, as scholars, as people who are involved in international partnerships, what are some of these levels that we are talking about? And what are some of those, they always talk about low-hanging fruit or win-win situations that you know, we can start to really begin making this change that we hope to see?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Samia. And one is that I really would like to congratulate you and all those in this debate for this initiative, because part of what we can do is to have more of these discussions and have much more frank discussions about this. And the fact that we can come together as a community of practitioners. And like when I was looking at the list, maybe this was designed so, but I don't see most of our African colleagues here. So if at all we could deliberately, in moving forward, have opportunities for exchanging mutually, having forums in Africa, forums in other parts of the world. And now with the digital transformations, it's much easier now to have communities of practice that can come together and reflect together on this. And the more we do things together equally, the more we can address this. Secondly, Samia, is the issue of capacity. Part of the challenge that most of African institutions and African practitioners have faced is the challenge of capacity. And I think we've taken quite a long time debating and believing that capacity can only be built by us going to the West. But I think we now should go hybrid by also taking advantage of some of the possibilities now within the African continent to develop critical masses of people like practitioners in internationalization or young researchers. And that brings me to that, my third point, a concentration on the young Africans, supporting young people from the African continent to get possibilities of developing the right skills, not to assume that Europe has all that it wants, so that we create platforms for them, build confidence in them, where they can actually very well relate to our counterparts in the West. But again, the low-hanging fruits, again, the policymakers, the design of projects from our European counterparts, if at all we can, because projects are designed, initiatives are designed, and then we have to respond to them. If at all there were possibilities of getting ways through, we can construct this together. So you will find that the way some of the projects are designed, developed, are actually not very well fitting to some institutions. And at times, when you look at even relations, I've worked a lot in the African context, you see the usual universities, the usual players are the ones which are there year in, year out. We don't give opportunities for younger institutions, for younger people to get possibilities to actually participate. So let's look for ways of making the ground more level. Samuel, I hope I'm not taking so much time. Let me stop it here.
No, thank you so much, Joey. I wish we had much more time. I would like to, immediately respond on so many things that you said, but I think you've given us a really good suggestion around what are some of the smaller things that we can do, probably in the context of our immediate partnerships. And then I think I totally agree with you. For the big things, I think we have to use organizations like UniPID to really lobby those that develop funding mechanisms. Too many are still framed within development
finally,
cooperation. Yes, go.
and finally, Samia, I think we as Africans also need to look at what we have. We actually have enormous resources around us. We actually hello. So
Yes.
whenever we design projects, we design institutions, we develop with in the back of our minds, we want our brothers from Europe to support them. But I think we need actually to look at what we can actually do with our locally based. I look at, for example, I'm not bad mouthing my organization, but I look at the amount of resources we use, and if at all we could possibly also utilize the resources that we have in some of the most pragmatic ways, we could also move some steps. So I think there is also reflection that we need to do as African universities, African institutions, to see that we bite or we take steps that are commensurate to what we want. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, Joey, we've now really run out of time, but I would like to thank you wholeheartedly for being with us today and for sharing your thoughts, experiences, perspectives, and suggestions as to how we can bring about change individually and collectively. So I hope everybody is joining me and giving you a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much. Okay, all right. Well, let me shift perspective for a moment. What I would like to do is just to give you perhaps a little bit of background from myself. And this is that I had looked particularly into North-South partnerships as part of my research. My PhD, in fact, focused on North-South partnerships in higher education, the challenges that these partnerships pose, and also how we can address them. I used a South African case study, a South African university, where I had interviews with a number of people from across the board, from all the different faculties, so people who are involved in research projects, in teaching projects, but also a number of administrators from the research office, the international office, the legal office, etc., etc. And I shared my insights, I think, in a number of ways, in some of the articles that I've written, chapters that I contributed to books. And a lot of those resources will be made available to you when we publish our resource list. So don't worry about being able to read up on some of this, but in a nutshell, I think my thesis confirmed what many practitioners in the field know, that there are imbalances in these partnerships between institutions in the North and in the South, and often it is that the Northern institutions are disproportionately benefiting from partnerships. Partnerships have been characterized and criticized, perhaps to some extent, as extractive relationships, where talent and people in particular, and sometimes data is being extracted from southern destinations to northern universities and institutions. And that, of course, is particularly challenging. In the keynote that I gave to the UniPID seminar in December last year, I specifically highlighted some of the challenges along issues such as attitude and expectations, but also funding and resources, knowledge creation and knowledge generation, and also dissemination to some extent. I looked into some of the examples, shared some of the quotes from my research for illustration purposes, and I will do that again today. I think that's where I'm going to leave it. We will touch on a number of the more specific examples and scenarios as we continue with the workshop. So let me go right into our first engagement, and I really invite you to join this discussion and tell me, what do you hear, or what do you understand when you hear, what do you think is involved in these terms, coloniality and decoloniality? Perhaps you can indicate in the chat box or raise your hand, are these terms familiar to you? These are very important concepts that I think form the background of a lot of the conversations that we can have about power dynamics in partnerships and in global relations generally. And so I think it is quite important for us to have an understanding of what we mean here. Is there anybody, I'm going to check the chat box just to see if there is anyone who's made a comment. I don't see anything. Is there anybody who would like to speak? Or perhaps I make a proposal here first and share with you how I see these terms, and then we will break them down a little bit further. So the two scholars that I particularly draw on when I look at issues of coloniality and decoloniality are Nelson Maldonado Torres, and particularly an article that he wrote in 2011. And as I said, don't worry about the resources. These will be made available to you. The second is a colleague who was long based in South Africa, but recently moved to Germany. Professor Sabelo Ndlovu-Gacheni wrote a piece in 2013. These two really reinforce and reinform each other. And so I put them both up here, one from a Latin American perspective, Professor Maldonado Torres, and Ndlovu-Gacheni from an African perspective. But they both summarize coloniality and what coloniality means as a power structure, an epochal condition, and an epistemological design. So this is something that I think is quite important for us to reflect on, not only generally, I think, in the context of our countries, societies, regions, and the globe in general, but particularly in the context of education, higher education specifically, and partnerships. So in the next examples that I will share, we will drill down a little bit more into what this means. But for now, just understand that coloniality is seen as a structure, a design, a system that indicates what the power relations are. And of course, these are informed by the history of colonialism and the world as we know it as a result of that. Decoloniality then, on the other hand, deals with the dismantling of these power relations and knowledge conceptions, and also relates to what both Maldonado Torres and Ndlovu-Gacheni refer to as the decolonization of knowledge, of power, and of being. So I hope as a background, this is an indication to you that these are issues that are important for us to discuss when we look at power dynamics and partnerships and power relations, and what we can do about that. So I'd like to invite you, please, to look at these examples. I hope these pictures are big enough on your screens to see. And before I speak to them specifically, can you give me an indication of what they mean to you? Kind of like the first things that come to mind. Let's start with this one. I'm circling it. I hope you can see this. I'll tell you what it is. It's a picture of me at my own PhD graduation ceremony in 2019, and I graduated from the University of the Witwatersrand, which is based here in Johannesburg, South Africa. So you see here, this is the university crest. I use this as an example of coloniality. Does anybody have an idea of why I would choose an example like this? Oh, I see there is a hand. That's wonderful. Please. Suchitana, if you can unmute yourself and you put your camera on, that's wonderful. Thank you. So we can all see you. Please share with us, what do you think this picture is all about?
Well, I will guess, so I might be wrong. But I think that coming from India, I kind of understand this, that we have accepted the ways and means of their acceptance of us, like they are the superior, the sir, or that kind of titles that they give, and that kind of, that is thought of as higher, like that is something that is the symbol of superior or best. So not kind of thinking from our own cultural perspective, but accepting their symbols and accepting their ways of doing things as the as kind of reflecting our standards or our achievements, so to say. So this is just my thought. I might be totally wrong.
No, you're not totally wrong. Thank you for sharing that. Can I ask you a follow-up question?
Yes, please.
When you say symbols, can
Yeah.
you specify what symbols in particular you are talking about in relation to this picture, into this image?
So it seems like someone is entitling or endowing something on you, like kind of accepting you from higher up as the symbol of the person behind you is kind of
okay.
That's
part of the process of capping. And the person here is the president of the WITS convocation, which includes all the alumni of and previous graduates. Okay, that's interesting. Thank you for sharing. I'm not going to respond right away because I see there's another hand up. So let's go on to Ken. Ken, what is it that you think when you see this picture? How is that possibly relating to the issue of coloniality that I touched on?
So what strikes out most to me is the fact that the white lady that is behind you is standing on a pedestal and sort of conferring you the PhD degree. So for me, that standing on a pedestal, it's very symbolic. It means that maybe she may be of higher status than you or something like that. So for me, that's the most symbolic part of this picture. Standing on a pedestal. Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting. And I think you both picked that up. That's actually something that I never thought about. The issue that I wanted to illustrate here is that it's the gowns. So it's also a symbol in a way, but it's what people are wearing in this picture. If you can see that this is a picture of the graduation ceremony at a university in Africa. A university that is very proud of its location in Africa, and yet the academic dress, the robe that everybody at a graduation ceremony wears, is patterned on that of the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, and London. And that is a colonial legacy in higher education. This is something that I wanted to point out, that sometimes, we are part of a system and we accept things as the way that they are. This is the way that graduation ceremonies are done. And it is useful in the context of our conversation today to actually, think about this and challenge this and critically reflect on what it is that we take for granted in our everyday kind of academic lives and what happens at universities. This is a screenshot from the African Network for Internationalization of Education website, and it's in the context section to say, who we are and where we are. And the issue that I wanted to highlight here for you is that you see under contacts, it gives as a physical address the Margaret Thatcher Library at Moy University. Again, I'd like to invite you to reflect on that for a moment. And please share with me, what do you think is the relevance of this example in the context of a discussion on coloniality? Does anybody who is not the two speakers that we've just heard from, does anybody want to share their views and perspectives on this example? Okay, I don't see any hands. All right, well, then I'm going to give it away. The issue here is that of names of buildings. The university, the library is called the Margaret Thatcher Library, and yet it's not a library that is located in the UK. It is located at a public university in Kenya. And those of you who are familiar with the decolonization conversations, and particularly the student movements, will have seen that there is a lot of attention now that is being paid to names of buildings, for example, on university campuses, to ensure that they reflect African history, African tradition, and not those of former colonial masters. So this is another example that I wanted to share with you. The third one is Oh, I see, Kenya. You put something in the chat. Thank you. The third example was a headline that was published in 2018, so about 4 years ago, where it said Nompumelelo Kapa is the first academic to write a thesis in isiXhosa in the 102 years of Fort Hare. Now, Fort Hare is a university in South Africa. It's located in the Eastern Cape province, where isiXhosa is the main language. And of course, it's a local language, one of the 11 official South African languages that are officially spoken in South Africa. Now, can you guess why is this a headline that is worth including in a conversation around coloniality and decoloniality? Anybody wants to contribute to this reflection, share their thoughts? Please go ahead.
Well, again, I might be wrong, but is it because that after 102 years of that someone from the isiXhosa, like someone from the native aspect has been writing the thesis, which should have been done already, like it shouldn't wait 102 years. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is perhaps because you mentioned India, this is perhaps also something that is relevant in your particular context. And of course, it speaks to the continued use of colonial languages in Africa, in India, in other regions in the world. And in South Africa, I mentioned that we have 11 official languages. English is one of them. But as you can imagine, English is the language that is the most dominant in terms of general communication and also particularly in terms of the medium of instruction at universities. And so it is the language in which most students at most South African universities will be taught, will be writing their research reports, their theses, like this particular example. And in the case of Fort Hare, it took 102 years for someone to be able to write a PhD thesis in their mother tongue. Imagine that, put yourself into your own context in Finland or another country and think about what that would mean if you had been asked from the start to do all your formal communication in a language that's actually not your own, not your mother tongue, not your first language, often not even your second or your third language. And so this is another legacy of colonialism that continues in higher education, specifically in South Africa and in other African countries. And of course, there are other languages, French, Portuguese, etc., that we can look at here. So the last one is a New York Times article that I think sums it up quite well, to say colonialism made the modern world. Let's remake it. So I think that speaks both to the aspect of coloniality, where we say we acknowledge that there is a legacy of colonialism that continues to linger. And in that sense, coloniality is different from colonialism because colonialism ended officially when former colonies gained their independence. But colonial structures, colonial designs, colonial epistemologies, etc., continue. And that is something that we see particularly in higher education. In South Africa, for example, the universities as we know them were all set up in the 19th century as institutions to serve the settlers, the British and Dutch settlers. The universities of Cape Town and Stellenbosch were the first institutions to be set up, and that legacy continues. So everything that we know higher education to be in terms of its institutions, in terms of its teaching, the curriculum, of course, is an important point, I think, that we can perhaps touch on a little bit later. The ceremonies and customs that we know, the language that we speak, all of that is colonially influenced, if I can say it like that. And that's one of the reasons why I like a quote that Professor Walter Minolo, another very prominent Latin American decolonial scholar, shared with us in a lecture that he gave at the University of Pretoria in 2018. And he put it this way: coloniality is not over, it is all over. And this was quite a profound statement for me that really helped open my eyes to, looking around the world as I know it and as I experience it, and taking this as a kind of like a lens through which I was then invited to reflect on and criticize and critique some of the things that we see. So I hope this is as eye-opening a statement for you as it was for me. And I would like to end this conversation on coloniality and decoloniality at this particular point. Thank you for those of you who participated. I would like to go back to my presentation and see if I can share this with you again. Okay. Colleagues, in the interest of time, I am going to be very brief on some of the things that I had hoped we would be able to discuss. And so, because as we said at the beginning that we want to particularly touch on decolonial approaches, I think they have to some extent already been mentioned and referred to in some of the comments that both Dr. Joey and I made. So I would like to just also remind you of the keynote that I gave at the UniPID seminar, which the recording of is available. And so I think it's fine for me to be here very brief and to just say that for me, the essence of decolonial approaches, decolonial thinking to partnerships and to internationalization is really three things. The first one is positionality. We really have to understand who we are, from which perspective do we speak, what's our view of the world, how do we see the world, what influences that, and how does this inform our relationships with others. The second one is mutuality, which is really that commitment to mutual benefit, to inclusion, to creating partnerships and better societies for everybody. And the third one, and this is the one that I want to spend a little bit more time on, that's one of the reasons why it's highlighted, is criticality. You asked, what is it that we can do? For me, and Joey, you highlighted in your presentation that one of the biggest challenges is our mental state, actually, our attitudes, our expectations, not only on behalf of Northern partners going into partnerships with their Southern institutions, but actually also in your example on the continent and the kind of mental frameworks that we operate in and how they are influenced and how they relate to issues of coloniality and decoloniality. So I'd like to just spend a little bit of time on illustrating what one of the important first steps could be for me. And that is really to deal with this realization that we experience a normative Eurocentrism. In the UniPID tender document that Eva and I responded to in terms of developing this workshop or this training program, it was stated that, in principle, the global academic collaborations are expected to be on equal, reciprocal, and responsible partnerships. But despite good intentions, North-South collaboration discourses and practices still often turn out to be fairly Eurocentric. And I'd like us to spend a little bit of time to say, what does this actually mean? What does Eurocentrism mean? Often it refers to colonialism, putting Europe at the center of the world, seeing the world from Europeans' perspectives, from Europeans' eyes, so to speak. And they have become the norm through colonialism and through coloniality. And this is something that I think we are not always aware of. So I'd like to invite you, for example, as a first step, to start thinking about things like terms that you use, concepts that you use, and critically reflect on them and to say, what is it that we mean? I'll give you two examples. One is global. Very often we hear the word global. Now, global is, if you look at a dictionary, is expected to mean representing the world, representing the globe. But a lot of the global initiatives that I've come across, that's actually not the case. So you sometimes look at a global university network there that is heavily dominated by European and American institutions, for example. Or you look at global studies where European and American perspectives prevail, and perhaps every once in a while a global South perspective is invited, but it's not a true reflection and representation of the globe. This, I think, is an illustration of where Eurocentrism sits in the context, in the framework of our international partnerships, for example. Another one is that very often countries in the global South are considered underdeveloped. From whose perspective is that the truth? In critical studies and critical perspectives, you will find examples where to say, but is it really true that Africa is underdeveloped? Could you perhaps look at it differently and say Africa is overexploited? So that brings in a completely different perspective, completely different questions, etc. In fact, there are also those conversations, to say African countries are not poor. The countries are not poor. They are rich countries. Joyce, you mentioned that, this is something that we have to realize and bring into our partnerships. But we have a lot of poor people who live in these countries. So this is a different kind of approach to some of the very common terms and concepts that we so often use. Another one that I want to just highlight, because I think it's also so important in the context of international partnerships, is actually the Sustainable Development Goals. The reason is that the goals are often used as a framework. In fact, there are many funding mechanisms, for example, where partnerships have to show evidence of how they relate and how they support the Sustainable Development Goals. But again, here, there are critical perspectives that one can apply to this. I want to just give, because we really don't have so much time, I just want to give one example, and that is around the SDG 1, poverty, and how that is framed. The SDG 1 says no poverty is something that we want to achieve. And again, you can ask yourself, what are the different perspectives of how you look at that? In South Africa, for example, the expected poverty, well, at the moment, in terms of statistics, South Africa and statistics from the World Bank, you see that the poverty rate at South Africa sits at about 55%. I think the global expected poverty rate for 2030 is 7%, which means obviously we are not likely to achieve that goal, but it also means there's a huge discrepancy between different regions, different countries, and how they relate to this goal of what does this mean to achieve no poverty by 2030. Another element that one can take into consideration here, for example, is that South Africa is a very unequal, if not, I think in March this year, a publication actually now put us at the very top of that list, the most unequal country in the world, where there is a huge discrepancy between rich and poor, and where about 1% of the population have as much wealth as the remaining 99% altogether. And so in that context, the issue actually perhaps that one can ask, or the question that one can ask is poverty really the problem here? Or is wealth the problem? Do we have to do something about wealth being, centralized in the hands of very few? So these are some ways in which I think we can engage with concepts, with frameworks that we take for granted, and we can critically question and have conversations with ourselves in terms of self-reflection, and then of course with our colleagues and partners around these issues to say, what does this now mean in our context? And perhaps this is one of the ways in which we can start making a difference. Now, we would like to move on to our breakaway sessions. And we're going to try and see, I think we're going to have to cut our time in in the breakaways a little bit short so that we can catch up on the time that we've lost. What I would like to do is for each breakaway group, and we're going to be in 4 groups today, but 2 groups each will look at the same general topic. I would like us to particularly focus on knowledge creation on the one side and resources on the other, and of course in relation to power relations and in North-South partnerships, which we've discussed. So again, those who were in the first workshop will know this. It would be wonderful if you could identify a spokesperson. So this is somebody who takes some notes or remembers the conversation and reports back to the plenary when we meet again in the big group. Please discuss the power dynamics with your specific focus in mind. So either the knowledge creation or the resources. I'm going to give you some examples, and I would like you to address the following questions. How does Northern dominance manifest in partnerships? You can use the examples that we will provide, or you can reflect on your own practice and add to that. What can we do about it? This relates to Joey's call for action to say, let's start thinking about very specifically and concretely about how can we change this? And particularly, of course, this means how can we shift power to the South? So I have 2 sets of examples that I would like to share with you. Again, these are quotes from my PhD research on North-South partnerships, specifically the interviews where colleagues in the South say things like what you can see on the slides here. I'm just going to read them out very briefly. They don't want an intellectual input from our side, is one quote. Another one, there's this conventional gaze from the North to the South, and a convention of Northern theory and Southern field studies. To some extent, we touched on this in last week's workshop. There's also a historical notion that the North is sort of the center of knowledge, while the South becomes the space in which the North implements ideas. We have inherited structures of knowledge and pedagogy from the North, which we were just implementing here unthinkingly. Conceptually, philosophically, we need a new paradigm. So these are some of the quotes that I chose to include here, just to illustrate what are some of the power dynamics and challenges related to that when it comes to knowledge creation. Reflect on these, see are they relevant, find your own, and then go into the discussion in breakaway sessions 1 or 2. Groups 3 and 4, I would like you to look specifically at funding and resources. We highlighted how important these in particular are. And the quotes that I chose here are, for example, that Southern scholars say that they are anxious about the consequences of resources being monopolized by Northern institutions and the unequal politics that derive from that unequal control over resources. Another observation was made about where the money actually goes. And someone says, there's $1 billion of aid coming to Africa. And it turns out that 950 million is actually spent on American companies in America. Another one with regard to research, the North's impress on the science and technology and research agendas of the South can be explained in terms of a number of factors, the most obvious being the North's ability to unleash significant amounts of funding. And I've given you, this was not mentioned in an interview, but in the literature review that I had done, the same for the second quote here. Perhaps not all money should be accepted as a stimulant for development. I think these are some of the things that Joey also touched on. So at this point, I would now like to invite you to go into the breakaway rooms. Eva will divide us into 4 groups, join the room, and then come back in about 20-25 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. Let's start with group number 1. Who was group 1? And that was a knowledge creation group. Just share your feedback with us. If you can do it in 2 minutes, that would be fantastic. Who is speaking for group 1?
I think it was me. Okay, so greetings from group number 1. We talked about knowledge creation. Well, first of all, I think we talked quite a lot about positionality and of maybe very concrete collaboration that we had experiences from, whether it was on research collaboration or doctoral education or whatnot. that we need to set up an as equal and explicit setting as possible, being critical towards basically everything, also learning from earlier collaborations, and also dialogue, the importance of dialogue was stressed. Then also very interestingly, we thought that setting the goals very clearly and jointly in the beginning might be a good way to give voice to all people, but basically, of course, to colleagues from the global south, but maybe also more to women, etc., etc. Then we talked a little bit about sheer numbers, how that reflects to power, also kind of the hard relationship between theory from the north and maybe fieldwork done in the south. About the northern case, we thought of some concrete examples on how to be explicit on what the south can't and is contributing. So maybe also just showing some good examples, like from migration or the lessons learned from the pandemic, how Ebola or Zika viruses, for instance, have been dealt with in the global south. Very interestingly, we talked also about that literature and theories come so often from the West, and how we need to reshift our thinking and really dig up for alternative choices of literature as well. So very tangible things we talked about were like joint publications, focusing on young researchers, and maybe also publishing more and more in Africa as well and through African channels. And then very obviously, knowledge creation and resources are connected. So knowledge creation impacts resources and vice versa. So yeah, this may be something to conclude with. But very briefly, and now I ask my colleagues from Group 1 to point out to everything that I missed. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna. I think if there is no one, I don't see any hands up, so I think we can move on to the second group that discussed the same. Let's see what kind of turn your reflections and your dealing with these issues took. So can I invite the person who is speaking for Group 2, which also looked at knowledge creation, to speak? If you have something to share, I think you can share your screen. Otherwise, just please unmute and talk to us.
I can try to put something together then, and then like our others in the group can maybe support me with this. So basically, first thing that like small steps may be important. We brought up this example of, for instance, the kind of conference where Finnish higher education and research has been kind of marketed to southern partners, and the title of which was first Future is Made in Finland, after which it was changed to the African context as Future is Made with Finland. It's a very small change, but like it might make difference. At the same time, we kind of discussed that, like, is it only image still? Like does it then in the end, like what, like we do small changes, but like we need to kind of dig into deeper and see what is behind those changes as well. And like in that sense, maybe question our own kind of aims for decolonizing as well. That like, are we actually ready to the real change, or making just like a kind of this kind of superficial changes here? As all in all, like mutual learning and co-creation was considered as the kind of important starting point for collaboration. We were discussing about this kind of participation in events, workshops, and so on, and this collaboration that they should be 50-50 from North and South. Then also the like who are actually speaking and giving keynotes in conferences and events and so on, and in which roles. So basically, for instance, that the Southern partner is not only representing the Southern problem kind of in this kind of situations, and then that there's kind of Northern experts telling about those problems and so on, but also then turning this around in a way that we would also, for instance, in Finland, we would need these kind of diverse partners looking at our Northern problems, and that should be balanced as well. And at the same time, as we, for instance, in these workshops, we think about what are the kind of issues in the context of doing fieldwork in the global South, but like we should also discuss what are the issues in the doing the collaboration in North and these kind of field situations. So to kind of like balance these ways of thinking about the collaboration and where it happens and from whose perspectives, just from the beginning. Maybe that's in short.
Okay, thank you so much. Can I then ask group 3 or 4? You both looked at issues of resources and particularly funding. So who can speak to group 3?
Hey.
Yes, please. I see your camera's on, your microphone is on. Please go ahead. Share with us what the discussions in your group were.
Yeah, so we were discussing that in the main idea was that we all felt that we do not hear the voices, and this kind of northern dominance which we are discussing, and almost all of us felt that the voices of the South are not being heard. And Melissa was saying that of course, there is a problem of the size, that Africa is a big country and there are huge like diversity in the thinking and the culture and interests also. And when compared to the EU, sometimes we are hearing more prominent voices from EU member states when compared to all the AU or African member state countries. So that is already beginning of a imbalance in the hearing. And then I was suggesting that, yes, it's sometimes those who have been under colonial rule for long, and I kind of say that from my own experience coming from India, that it's kind of we get in these ideas, colonialistic ideas are so incorporated in our thinking that many a times we forget what is our own indigenous and what is accepted from foreign. And we have to also, as countries who have been under that kind of colonialistic rule, have to discuss and bring out the voices from more grassroots level, so that it needs this discussion within the countries, and then it can reach to the level where it can go beyond and in the international level. And Rosanna was also saying the same, that yes, we need to listen, but then who do we listen to? And that has been kind of a question that was within our group. And also, Melissa was saying that sometimes it has happened that if there is an easiness to work, that some European university has established a collaboration with one particular or few particular universities, say in countries like South Africa, then we kind of continue with that instead of trying to find more voices with the more smaller universities. Yeah. So those which are easy to collaborate, so to say, we tend to continue collaboration with those instead of giving chances to the others. Okay. And
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you because we are running out of time. Is there maybe 2 or 3 things that you share very specifically, very shortly, as to what exactly specifically can be done?
Can be done is what Kavita said, that maybe students who have visited outside can bring ideas how to make their own country and system more stable, and then also to have the grant structure so that there can be in the beginning a discussion that what is the interests and how to kind of share the funding from the beginning so that the voices can be heard equally.
Okay, thank you so much. Wonderful. And I'm so sorry for rushing us along. No, I'm just really mindful of our time. Okay, can I ask group number 4, who also looked at the resources issue? And you actually touched a lot on the knowledge creation, which again shows, you know, that all of the things that we are talking, of course, are interrelated. We can't do the one without the other. Can I have from the 4th group, who was that? Eva, is that you? I see you put your camera on. Oh, yes, you're sharing your screen. Excellent.
Thanks to my group, and please fill up anything I don't mention. So we talked about certain things, and one of the challenges we found, which tends to dominate the partnerships, is mindsets and structures. And we talked about how these are normally quite invisible, and how there is also a lot of unconscious bias, and how, because people are not conscious of this when they are in these partnerships, then they don't actually enact any like equitable practices, or they don't know how to actually enact equitable partnerships. Then we talked about the issue of finance and how imbalancing financial resources influences the way the partnerships are formed. And obviously, like, this affects power dynamics. The more resourced a partner, the more they tend to have more power to and agility to conceptualize how the partnership is going to be implemented. We talked about what could be some enablers. So there was an example of a lot of investment goes into creating win-win partnerships and equitable partnerships, but these need to be reinforced and supported by frameworks at institutional level. So if you go to great lengths to think about how to make partnerships equitable, but they can't actually be adapted and adopted at institutional level, then they'll fail. Another solution we talked about is understanding privilege and unlearning privilege. There was a very good question about that from somebody in the group asking, at what point should this unlearning be instigated? At what point should we start to talk about the superiority complexes and unlearn this thinking? So that's a question to you, Samia and Joey. One thing that came up was about, and how we addressed this was in the context of, we talk about win-win, but there could also be win-loss. And we discussed, what do we mean by win-loss? So the loss here, after discussing it a bit deeper, turns out to be power. So the loss from a northern partner will be about giving space to southern voices and understanding that, and allowing them to be able to articulate their interests and to be able to be part of that conversation and being included in developing partnerships. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Eva. Thanks for sharing this. Thank you to all the spokespeople for sharing with us the discussions that happened in your groups. It's really much appreciated. I am going to take us back to my slide. I think, unfortunately, we've come to the end, so I'm not going to be able to discuss some of the things that I had wanted to highlight. But I think, especially Johanna, also thank you for giving us a lot of concrete examples now in how we can make a difference in terms of implementing and really committing to bringing about this change in small ways. I think you've given some really specific, concrete examples of how we can go about that. And so one of the things that perhaps also is important when it comes to funding is that even if we acknowledge that funding does come from one of the partners in a partnership, the issue of control over that funding, for example, is something that can still be discussed, and ownership of the funding can be considered more equitably, even if it is mostly one partner, for example, or one organization that provides the funding. So there are a number of ways, I think, in which each of the partnerships that we are already involved in can be learning grounds for us, for reflection, for engagement, for dialogue with our partners. Say, do our partners actually see the same things as we do, et cetera, et cetera. So what I would like to do now is really just close us out. I think it's too complex, too rich a discussion for me to try and summarize everything. I do think that the conversations in the plenary and in the breakaway sessions really have confirmed that power dynamics is something that is, all around us, whether we like it or not. It's something that we have to deal with and that we have to address. And the more open and frank and transparent we are about it, the more fruitful I think it is going to be for our partnerships. And so I'd like to encourage you to take up Dr. Joey's call for action, and to say, when you go back to your workplace, into your partnerships, really start thinking about what is it that you can do, what are the small things that you can do that you can implement almost immediately, and what are some of the bigger things that we can tackle within our institutions, but also collectively as people who work in a particular national context, for example, or in a regional context. When we talk about Europe and Africa, those things are important. How can we influence the EU? How can we influence the AU, et cetera, with a commitment to mutuality and a willingness to address a lot of these issues that are sometimes sensitive, I think we can definitely make a change. And Eva, you mentioned the issue of privilege. So this is a thing to me that obviously I don't think, unfortunately, we'll have time to discuss now. But I'd like to point out to you that when the learning bites are made available to the workshop participants, please look out for Learning Bite 2, because it deals with power from the perspective of identity and privilege. And one of the concepts that is used there as part of a privilege skill set, for example, is that once you know what your privilege is and you acknowledge that you have it, you can use it. And you can repurpose your privilege. So this is a different way of looking at, Eva, I think what you spoke about in terms of loss. It does not necessarily mean negatively that you frame it in the context of loss, that you lose power, but that you share your power with others and that you use your power to the benefit of others, to extend the benefit to others. So I think this is, again, a different perspective, perhaps, of how we can look at it. So in closing, and apologies for going a little bit over time today, but in closing, I'd like to invite you, please, to complete the feedback form. We received some really good feedback on the first, good in the sense of numbers and also qualitatively on the first workshop. So thank you for that. Please do share your perspectives, your feedback with us. It's going to be so important to inform what we can do in the future. And remember, next week's workshop is already on Monday, so not very far away, on the 16th of May, those of you who will be with us, to look at partnership administration and management, and that's at 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock Finnish time. I'd like to thank you very much for being here with us today. If you have any more questions, here is an email address at unipid-info@helsinki.fi that you can contact for any queries about this workshop and the training program in general. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for participating actively. Eva has shared the link to the feedback form in the chat. It will also be sent to you, I think, afterwards again. And so thanks for being with us. Thanks for all your input and for actively engaging with us and with each other. We really appreciate that. Goodbye.